The process of creating an abstract from a real scene is known as abstraction. One confronted with a work of abstract art might say, "I don't get it," but I'm going to ask you to consider them images that invite contemplation. A photo out of camera is a quotation of reality. What you see is what you get. And in this case, a guy riding his horse on a snowy night in the trees. Very literal. As opposed to this. So take a moment to stop and read "Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening" and this painting. You can pause the video. Wow, what a difference. Here the painter and the poet took the simple scene, contemplated it, extracted and related their experience in a way that the audience could do likewise. Think of abstraction as a potential continuum from accurately and faithfully representing a scene to not being able to recognize the subject at all, as seen here in the Jackson Pollock. So here's a quotation of reality, a very representational photograph of a tiger. But that can be abstracted to a form that's still easy to recognize, but less realistic and maybe evoking a mood that the previous one did not. From this to this. And we can go further into cubism, and a bit harder to recognize, emulating cubism and more camouflaged, and even further to a form that's hard to recognize but still has an element of representation in it. So going from representational to a form hard to recognize. One way to put it would be to transmogrify the ordinary. So transmogrification can be like taking a cucumber and making it into a pickle. But in the case of Salvador Dali, taking a pocket watch and bending it and drooping it off of a table. When one gets into creating an abstract work, he is freed from the requirements, restrictions, and expectations of representational imaging. Moving into perhaps theism, metaphysics, feeling, intuition, introspection, imagination, even fantasy, versus the dedicated to scientific fact, natural appearance, the rules of National Geographic or of photo contest. It's non-Newtonian seeing and thinking, flexible and adaptable, that doesn't follow a rigid set of rules. One can go out with his camera and, knowing the software, look at a scene and see the potential beyond what is actually there. You can investigate the reality rather than capture it. You can evoke the spiritual or visceral impact of the pre-visualized image one is about to create. I take a moment to think back to a guy riding his horse versus stopping by a wood on a snowy evening. Photographing a scene with this abstract intent allows you to approach a very popular scene, but make it unique and hopefully more impactful. This is a very typical photograph of a building in Tacoma, and this is a different approach, an abstract approach. Abstract painting is also known as non-figurative, non-objective, or non-representational art. It's a visual art genre that uses color, shape, form, and line to create a composition that may be independent from visual references in the world. We achieve this by perhaps removing elements that will simplify the scene, remove distractions, things that aren't contributing to our composition, perhaps even ruining the composition. Or we can distort or exaggerate things using color manipulation, textures, distort or exaggerate a real object to communicate a mood or feeling. But we can also create something entirely new, producing something that has no source in external reality. Abstract photography can be done in camera. At its purest, it's still representative, but it's taken from the usual to the uncommon, perhaps a different perspective. Isolation, magnification. Using a different angle, a natural subject is taken, but it's now outside the box of common viewing. Isolated tree bark, peeling paint, macros, blurs, in-camera motion, long exposure, special filters, light painting, multiple exposure, a combination of these things. Capturing a pattern or the interruption of a pattern. Emphasis is on concept, composition, form, line, tonal contrast, scale, mood, motion, texture, either emphasizing texture or decreasing it. And then there's perhaps in the studio like a set, fantasy, and props. Beyond in camera is in post, using blurs, exaggeration, magnification, painterly effects, simplification, composites, effects like solarization, distortion, color and tonal manipulation. And sometimes this is through experimentation that leads to what may become a style. So here's a couple of examples. These are representational in that the one on the left is absolutely a photograph with a little bit of development and manipulation in post perhaps, but it's still an in-camera, mostly just isolating a portion of a building, getting the contrast between the smooth glass and reflections versus the hard metal geometric diamond shapes. And on the right, this is a magnification of the back of the head of a downy woodpecker. So we may know what the subject is. Maybe we won't recognize it at first glance, but it's being presented in an unfamiliar way. There's a bit of hide and seek in it, I think. It does cause the viewer to think. This is just a macro I took of glass on the glass bridge at the Tacoma Museum of Art. It's open-ended. There's no definite content. It emphasizes an aspect of a vase, in this case. Then we have patterns that we can capture. This is in Stuttgart, Germany. I'll bring it up again later. It's a lot about form, line, composition, contrast. And this is just a different way of seeing something very familiar. If you're familiar with the Tacoma Art Museum, it's a sort of conical almost smokestack-like structure that's glass covered, but by getting up close and shooting upward, doing it in black and white, this is what I got. We can find often natural forms and lines that lend themselves to abstraction. So on the left, corn lilies, in the middle, reflected flame, on the right, smoke. Here's Lyndon Glendahill's microscopic abstracts. This is long exposures, long exposure, in-camera motion that I took at Point Defiance, harbor on the left, and on the right was a mural on a pump house that I just used a wavy motion, in-camera long exposure. This is a body of work by Pep Ventosa, who does many, sometimes hundreds of exposures of a subject, and often moves around, for example, make a circular walk around a tree and just keep taking many exposures. And then in post he uses various blending modes to yield his final result, and it gives this painterly effect. Then, you know, is hyper-processing in camera or in post enough to call it abstract? Well, it's certainly a little beyond representational. Neither of these two scenes that I took in Budapest were exactly looking like this, but vastly improved in post. So this is still very representational. We can identify the windows, but they're simplified in post. There's pattern, and pattern interruption is really what this photograph is about. Then there's light painting, obviously planned and executed, but done in camera. Staged fantasy, where photographs of a child in a fantasy outfit is combined with a photograph of a mossy tree. But we can also create the abstraction in post by pushing the processing beyond the believable. Did you Photoshop that? Everything's photoshopped or pushed in camera. Special filters can be used, meaning software filters in Photoshop, for example, like solarization, path blurs, blending textures, compositing. You're all familiar with high-key photograph, low-key photographs. It's hopefully still respecting the guidelines of composition. So you can use special software like photo art programs, Corel Painter, Topaz Studio, AI-generated effects, and of course Photoshop. Here's a couple of high-key images. The one on the left is just really high-key, but the one on the right is pushed to just 2 bits. It's either a black or a white. There's no gray. I can't remember whose photograph this is on the left, but again, high-key. And here's two examples. One is low key and a high key of the same exact photograph that I pushed, and the histograms that result. And perhaps a much better portrait photographer with a model, Ms. Jodrovic, high key, low key and high key. These are path blurs that I did not in camera but in post using the blur gallery, Photoshop blur gallery path blurs. Then there's fantasy. Here's one by Logan Zilmer. A lot of it done in digital art. This is composites. So two photographs I took on the left. One is in-camera motion of some alder trees combined with a picture of a mummy. And on the right, my granddaughter, that I combined with one of my photographs from a forest and an outfit that I found online. And I created the magic wand and the bubbles. So as far as painterly conversions of an image, here's Budapest, looking down a pedestrian street towards the spa, and I converted it into a night scene that was painterly with a very brush stroke conversion. Here's a photograph somebody else took, Nancy, and I converted it into this sort of swirly stroked painting. Same thing in Chesky Krumlov, taking a photograph and converting it using Topaz Studio 2 into this image. And then you can use AI to convert the same image into a different painting. As far as using that artwork to simplify, isolate, study detail, or make a painterly conversion. The one on the left is taken from a bridge in Budapest with a building in the background, and all these geometric forms that are much better when simplified and isolated and done in black and white in a drawing like chalk and pastel. Same thing on the right. I think it helps just isolate the forms and perspectives. It can composite things that are partially recognizable, distort them, solarize them, color them, emulate abstract paintings like Impressionism, op art, pop art, watercolor. And you can really push that. So the one on the left, I took a photograph of a little statuette and really pushed my Topaz skills to get it to look like this. African art on the left. And then on the right is a totally AI-generated abstract art with the surreal space. And here's the prompt the guy used to generate it. Abstract art style, explosion of cosmic colors in a surreal space where energy waves ripple through the fabric of the unknown, a celestial ballet of light and sound. So how do you approach this in the field? Here's a photograph of the Porsche Museum in Stuttgart, Germany, that I visited. I took a picture of reflections in that building. So you can see the photograph on the left with a little bit of push of vibrancy and color and contrast, pushing it a little bit more with some simplification and more and more. You can get take the photograph and really push it towards the abstract. Same thing with the sculpture that was in the center, just isolating it and concentrating on the pattern, the bold contrast, the form, the line, the composition, darkening the background, and ending up with a more compelling composition than the thing that many people just walked by or maybe took the whole scene in a standard photograph. So to wrap this up, we record a scene or subject, harness that light to something more felt to convey a moment, a glance, a glint of light versus dark, of form, of movement. We simplify, transform, and isolate. The viewer may then have to contemplate and experience the image. His sensations may be different from others. The photographer has the freedom to be creative and to see with feeling the potential of the scene. Challenge yourself. Give yourself permission to photograph and process abstractly and try it. Alter your world. Be different. Now, I got some of the concepts and wording from a reference book that was recommended by a friend of Paul's and mine, Brian Barassa. And the book is The Edge of Vision, The Rise of Abstraction in Photography by Lyle Rexer. So instead of saying, my grandkid could do that with his crayons, we should look at this image and contemplate it. Let it evoke senses and ask why I have these sensations. Wonder about it. So let's see some contributions from the group and take a moment to silently contemplate them. And then if you want, say what they make you feel or think of. This one's by Ken Cutler. In-camera motion. Perhaps a different perspective makes one think of either grass on the left or hanging moss on the right. This is horizontal in-camera motion. And wavy in-camera motion. Nancy Crowell submitted this. This is a very good example of the Pep Ventosa technique. Multiple exposures combined to form to yield a painterly effect, like pointillism. Certainly a lot of recognition in that image and this one. Vertical motion of trees. To me, it provides interesting conflict or contrast between the soft, warm, blurry tones in the back of autumn grasses and leaves versus the very smooth and hard, sterile, cool tones of the trees and the white against the black. This is from Paul Dreyfus. Extremely representational, or recognizable, but presented in a very different way makes a wood duck far more abstract.